The proof arrived in a thin cardboard sleeve, 4 small glossy squares, the photographer's neat stamp at the back, a scrawled note, "Choices for the album," and then the image I could not unsee. It was not dramatic. There was no smeared blood, no cinematic ruin. It was quieter than that. A soft grey veil, like fog having passed through the negative, where Elliot's eyes ought to be. Not a hole so much as a refusal. His face otherwise was intact. Jaw softened at the laugh he always makes when someone tells a bad joke, his collar like a small frame. But where his gaze should anchor everything, the light had slid off. He looked as if someone had decided not to see him. I remember the first time I held that proof against lamplight, the smell of lemon oil in the study where the old leather album lived. The album was a thing my father had admired at our engagement party. Thick boards, handmade ends, the spine creased in that respectable way of books that have been read with reverence. My parents called it an heirloom. Elliot called it the ledger when he was in one of his moods. The ledger, as if it were a weather pattern you checked in the morning. The prenuptial covenant, of course there was one. In this town we take continuity as seriously as our crops, had a paragraph about the ledger, a clause tucked between accounts and attic access, assuring that whoever kept it would sustain the names within. The sentence had sounded to me then like a domestic promise, a line in a play, a thing to be performed while I wore a gown. So when the photograph failed, not with spectacle but with a tiny civil defect, I felt a fissure in that performance. The town turned the fissure into a rumor in a few hospitable hours. Someone called it a technical glitch. Another person whispered that the photographer had lost the negative. And by evening there were oblique texts. "Have you seen it? Is he okay?" The waiting room of the clinic, the bench outside the bookshop, the counter at the bakery, everywhere the proof became a whispered object. People love an aperture into the private. They love to be given permission to speculate. At first, Elliot took the calls the way he seems to take everything now, with a small arithmetic absence. He answered questions as if assigning weights to hypotheses. "It's a misprint," he told one persistent cousin who, because she had done floral arrangements for half the county, expected declarations. He made no promises of explanation, and in that measured way of his, let the conversation run out of steam. Then he stopped taking the interviews altogether. He stopped going to the town dinners, and in the space where he had once stood, hands in his pockets, voice coasting, that grey smear started shading how people spoke of our household. People like stories of discontinuity because stories need edges. The smear became a hinge upon which the town could revisit its assumptions. Was he embarrassed, they asked, or ill? Did he retreat because he could no longer bear to be seen? More than one neighbor made an effort to narrate his withdrawal as evidence. I would hear their sentences like a soft rain against window panes, inconclusive and persistent. It was easier, I think, for them to make him a mystery than to admit that a family could contain for itself a complicated answer. Elliot withdrew to the study and to the ledger. He had always loved the ledger in the way a person loves a practice. Quiet, repetitive, precise. He kept lists that read like prayer books. Names, dates, a small marginalia in looping ink, paid, visited, mended. When I married him, I understood the ledger as one of those small eccentricities that in the beginning supply charm. His habit of cataloguing the world as if it were a shelf to be dusted, his affection for margins. I did not understand its gravity. I assumed it lay on a shelf while we made ourselves visible to the town in receptions and volunteer guilds and polite generosity. I had trained for publicness. I knew how to stand at the edge of a room and fold my face into civil interest. I had spent a life learning how to look like a person people could trust to show up in a photograph. Learning what Elliot meant by keeping the ledger was not a single revelation. It was a slow apprenticeship that began with the small domestic alterations the town declared uninteresting, mending bindings, pressing out foxed pages, applying thin strips of linen to broken spines. The steward, who had been custodian of our family records for 30 years and whose keys made a small chiming when he walked, started coming twice a week. He pushed his thumb along the edge of a page and tapped it with the seasoned authority one reserves for an old engine. "You stitch the signature first," he told me once when my hands hovered over needles like a novice. "Otherwise the book tries to breathe wrong." His hands were large and ink-stained at the fingertips. His voice was made of small certainties. He wore woolen fingerless gloves in the dead afternoons, as if to remind everyone that care has cost. There are domestic crafts that teach you to see differently. Sewing a spine, you learn where the paper wants to split. Binding a ledger, you can feel the history of handling in the looseness of a hinge. I sat across from Elliot in the study with a needle in my fingers, looking as if I were rehearsing a role and learning to stitch the signatures in a steady rhythm. He would sit by the window, the lamplight catching his fine hair, and read aloud the marginalia as if narrating a novel. Sometimes the things he read were banal. Account paid. Letter returned to sender. Sometimes they were luminous. A tiny notation that said, for example, "Visited Mrs. G. brought mending, left apple tart. She spoke of the boy's name." For years those fragments had been anonymous chores. Now in his mouth they became testimony. On evenings when the rain kept the town inward, Elliot would ask for tea. He drank his without sugar, always in the same chipped blue cup that belonged to my mother's side. I learned to make it the way he liked. A single tea bag steeped in near-boiling water, milk poured after the first swirl, and then a cloth napkin smoothed over the saucer. The ritual was tiny. It was also a vow. As I poured the tea, I would try on the question I had been rehearsing for months. "Did you choose this? Did you choose to become the ledger's keeper?" There is a way a question sits in a room like a moth. It moves toward the light of what might be an answer, but flutters away when you approach. I made 100 different phrasings of it in my head. I tried tenderness. I want to understand what you feel. I tried legality. Were you bound by the covenant, or did you sign on of your own free will? I tried a performance I thought would be persuasive, earnest, charming, unafraid of the family's expectations. All of them sat hollow at the base of my tongue. He tended, with the ledger open between us, to answer in particulars. "This entry was made on Tuesday," he would say, or "the seamstress notes that Mrs. L. needed yarn." He gave me the names of things. He did not give me the shape of why he did it. Not yet. Rumor in any town feeds on the lack of an answer. The local paper, which has always been given to melodrama for the sake of circulation, ran a column about the difficulty of representing a public figure who might be withdrawing from the stage. The columnist asked, rhetorically, whether an image could fail to capture not only a person, but a role. The evening I read it aloud at the kitchen table, the steward tapped ash from his pipe into an old tin and said, "People prefer certainty, even if it's a lie." He spoke as if he were removing lint from a coat. The lawyer chimed in later at a family meeting. She had a ledger of her own, a legal pad where she recorded clauses with neat slashes, and she framed our options in procedural language. "We can draft an addendum," she said. "We can make custodianship reviewable. We can define custodial duties clearly, leave an exit clause." She read a tentative clause from her pad, the words juridical and dry. "Custodial responsibilities shall be assumed on a voluntary basis and subject to annual review by all parties." It sounded like a lock turned in a door. It also sounded to me like a paper shield against a more intimate problem. The question of consent. Consent is not merely a legal term, it is a moral practice. It lives in how we take on the small tasks that make someone legible to others. Is it consent when you inherit a ledger because your family's covenant suggests you must? Is it consent when you accept the stewardship because it provides you with a sense of moral architecture? Elliot's choice, as he would later tell me in fragments, had elements of both. But at this stage, his retreat only intensified the town's appetite. People began to crowd around the ledger by inference. The Foundation, a cultural institution from the city that collected representative artifacts, sent an efficient woman with a tight bun and a brochure. She asked for a viewing. She suggested an exhibition. The Ledger as Social Archive, she called it, and added helpfully, "We could display a photocopy of the smear." Elliot received them politely. He sat with the steward and the lawyer in the study, and he listened. Then he said no. His refusal was not a dramatic stand. He did not declaim about the sanctity of privacy. He said, in a voice that at the time felt to me like a ledger closing, "These are people, not specimens." The woman from the Foundation wrote a note in her pad and left with an air of unfazed disappointment. The town made of that no spectacle. It preferred to say he was being stubborn. I preferred then to tell myself a kinder narrative, that he saw people as whole, flawed, and thus unsuitable for display. His refusal was a moral choice, but also an aesthetic one. For him, to varnish a page was an erasure. The first letter I read, because reading is how he taught me to be closer, was not the kind of thing you expect to find in a ledger. It was folded and tucked into an old volume, the ink browned at the creases. Elliot set it on the table between two small weights, a china thimble and a lead soldier, as if these were the only tools required to weigh a testimony. He asked me to read aloud. It began, "My dear Mary Ann, I have no one now to take the hems but you. The boy who lived next door left for Nottingham and took his father's tools, and my hands, they shake in the morning as if remembering threads. I leave this note with Mrs. P because no one in my house knows the stitches I prefer. They say a blanket is only a blanket, but I know its seams hold together a life. If you can, write the name Thomas on the margin, and note, he takes sugar over tea and laughs at the cricket on Friday. If you cannot come, then I place it into your ledger, for I cannot remember why memory is slipping, but I remember where I put this letter. M." I paused at the signature because it was not a signature in the way our formal names appear on paper. It was a shorthand of a life. Marianne's handwriting looped like a vine. Elliot's fingers, calm, clerk-like, smoothed the page. He said quietly, "She came to me years ago, after her husband died. She had no one else who would come to the fits at night." He spoke the way you might speak of a clerk who has done his rounds. There are more letters like that, and in each one lies a small quotidian biography. The seamstress who writes of the boy who prefers sugar and bread. The gardener who leaves a note about a name easily overlooked. A note from a young teacher who borrowed a copy of Carlyle and never returned it. Elliot reads them as one might read a ledger of small debts. Debts of attention, of bread exchange, of a borrowed pot, where names are entry points into an economy of care. He told me, in a sentence that did not attempt to be heroic, that his project had been to collect these notations, to make a margin that would hold what the main account erased. I asked him once, again, a question that had become a litany, whether he had done it alone. "In a way," he said, "stewardship is often first acknowledged as single-handed. Then you discover that people add to it." He had, in time, trained the steward. The steward, in turn, had kept practices alive. A younger archivist, recent from university and still smelling of new learning, began to come and catalogue entries in a small, volunteerish way. The bookshop owner, Mrs. Halliday, whose hands were always crumb-streaked from biscuits and who kept a saucer of tea on the counter, contributed names whenever someone left a story on the counter. "People forget to sign," she said to me once, stamping a receipt. "They tell you their life over tea and think it's a small thing." Small things, I was learning, accrued into a moral ledger. Between the domestic practice and the public chatter, the lawyer proposed the addendum. We sat in her office with the steward, Elliot, my father, the man who taught me to add up accounts as though ethics could be arithmetic, and the bookshop owner, who came because she liked to be present when things of the town's sentimental value were discussed. The lawyer folded her hands and read a clause, then another, translating family anxieties into legal terms. We propose a clause for voluntary custodianship, she said. It will read, custodianship shall be assumed voluntarily and shall remain revocable upon a period of notice not to exceed 6 months. A custodial review shall be convened annually by an appointed panel comprised of family members and 2 independent community witnesses. When she had finished, my father tapped his pen against the desk with a noise that believed in the stabilizing power of punctuation. That seems reasonable, he said. My mother, who had spent years making sure our curtains matched the right season and that visitors were always shown to the best chair, pursed her lips. We must make sure the ledger still binds the family together, she said, and I felt in her a fear that the ledger could decouple the family rather than consolidate it. The steward, for his part, only listened. He is a man of ceremonies. He prefers the ritual to the uproar. The addendum was practical and necessary, I understood on the level the lawyer had articulated. But it did not solve the catechism inside my chest. Did he choose this? To sign on, to take those names into his quiet gravity, was it a choice freely given, or an obligation folded into a marriage vow? The legal language gave us recourse. It gave us an exit clause. It did not explain the moral project Elliot had, which existed before paperwork and continued irrespective of it. I could see him in his study, hands stained with ink, resolving the small problems of a life with method and tenderness, and the peculiar refusal to perform. Meanwhile, the town continued to offer thin narratives for consumption. There were op-eds. There were late-night conversations at the docks. There was one journalist who attempted a profile and, finding no scandal, wrote instead about the way a smear can alter how we look at a face. The journalist quoted an elderly neighbor who confided that she had always liked Elliot's quiet better than his pronouncements. The profile felt to me like a kind of kindness, not scandalous, simply curious. But the closer the town assumed they now had permission to inquire, the more our private rituals were at risk of being folded into a public story. Elliot responded to all of this, never by shouting, but by deepening into practice. He began to invest in the physical conservation of the ledger, as if preserving the material would preserve the dignity of the names within. He ordered conservation cloth, beeswax polish, linen thread. He learned to lift the spine without forcing it, to humidify brittle edges before smoothing them. I sat with him through these sessions more out of an obligation to be present than out of interest. Then gradually I became fascinated in the way his hands learned to move. There is an intimacy in conservation work, a contact with the past that is at once tactile and reverential. Sometimes when he repaired a broken hinge, he would slide the newly stitched pages into place and let them breathe like a body exhaling after a held breath. There were nights he would bring out a cassette, a gesture that made me smile because he prefers analog things, and play recordings of names being read aloud, an experiment in which the ledger met voice. The tape's cassette case had a handwritten note. Names, read 2015. Elliot would press play, and the room filled with ensemble sound. A thin, deliberate voice reading out the list of names that had accumulated over decades. Agnes W., Thomas L. In the Martinez family, an initial with a notation, left in a hurry. It was simple and it was intimate. The tape made the ledger exist in a temporality other than the shelf. I found myself learning not just the craft of mending, but the practice of small attention. Tea at lamplight, making notes in the margins for the steward, leaving an envelope at the bookshop for someone who could not write. These acts transformed my sense of marriage. I had come into our union used to public roles, chairing committees, organizing the benefit auction, ensuring photographs came out with all the right smiles. To be at Elliot's side in the study was to practice a different kind of fidelity, one that did not demand spectacle, but insisted on service. And yet there remained that central burning uncertainty. For months I rehearsed the question anew. I practiced it like a mantra and a test. I would lay out variations on my bedside table as if polishing them. Did you choose? Did you feel obliged? Were you enchanted by the idea of being needed? The problem was not that I doubted his honesty. It was that I was uncertain what count of motives would make a choice his. In our town, where duty and affection are often braided, motives are rarely simple. One evening, after the steward had left and the rain had moved on to slant into the gutters, I opened another letter. It was not tucked neatly this time. It was folded into a pocket at the back of the ledger, like a coin left for a toll. The handwriting was a small, tremulous script, and the paper had the faint scent of lavender. It read, "To whoever keeps the ledger, if you find this, please know that my sister Elsie kept my name on her keys until she died." I cannot say why I write this other than to note that names are not always saved by those who are nearest. Sometimes they are kept by those who notice an unfinished stitch. I'm getting old, and my sons are busy with their own lives. If you see my name, mark that Mrs. H likes when the kettle sings twice, and that she will not tell you her secret at once. Wait, let her tell it. L.C. I felt the paper like a pulse in my palm. It asked for patient, unassuming attention. It asked for a witness. The demand of it was not heroic. It asked in practice for someone to remember that the kettle sings twice, that a secret is to be coaxed, not extracted. I folded the letter and placed it where Elliot would find it, next to the needle marks he had left in the margin of the ledger that morning. He found it, read it, and then, without any flourish, added a small notation. Mrs. H, kettle twice. Approach gently. He wrote the note as one makes an entry of fact. In his handwriting it looked like a new inhabitant being logged into a census. After that night, my rehearsed questions began to take a different shape. They were less about catching him out and more about joining him in a practice. I wanted to know whether his assumptions had been mine, or whether this work belonged to him in a way that would survive my misunderstanding. I wanted him to tell me, slowly as he always did, what it meant to refuse spectacle. I wanted him to tell me why he declined the Foundation's offer, and why he took up the labor of names with such steady hands. The town, for its part, proved impatient with slow answers. The smear on the photograph remained a hinge. It moved between being obscene and being tender, depending on who held it. A journalist wrote that the smear made Elliot look like a man who preferred to be invisible, and another neighbor suggested that maybe he had always been invisible, and the smear had only made it obvious. I learned to listen to these small verdicts as if they were weather reports. They told you something about the day, but not about the ground beneath the house. The steward kept ritual. The lawyer kept clauses. The bookshop owner kept biscuits and, as it turned out, a ledger of her own in the back room where customers left names and recipes and small laments. The young archivist catalogued with earnestness. He brought in folders and labeled them like a man erecting a garden of files. Elliot kept repairing pages. I kept making tea. Somewhere between those acts, a new domestic choreography was forming. Then, on a late afternoon 2 months after the photograph had arrived, the town glided into an argument about truth. Someone had posted a copy of the photograph in the bakery in a frame meant for art, and a child pointed at it and laughed because it looked like a cloud. Others took that as an indictment, others a gentle joke. The baker, who had seen generations through his ovens, said to me as he slid a tray of scones toward a woman in the line, "We are all more interesting when we leave the corner unfinished." He meant the comment in the way an old man means anything he says, with a kind of weary clarity. That night, Elliot and I sat late in the study. The ledger was open, a page of names spread like a small city. He had been working on a sequence of marginalia about a family that had temporarily left town, and the margin had filled with notes about the children who liked to collect pennies, and about the mother who had mended sweaters until winter. He did not look up when I finally asked, the question arriving in my mouth with all the bluntness of a small shovel. "Did you choose this?" I said. He paused, his hands moving to straighten a page, as if smoothing a wrinkle in a letter. "I suppose," he said, "but choice is not always a single event. Sometimes it is an accumulation of small acceptances." He set the needle down. "People think decisions are made at one moment, when someone signs a line. But usually a life is arranged by many, many small refusals and acceptances. You accept a cup of tea. You accept a neighbor's confession. You refuse to display someone like an exhibit. Each of those is a vote for a shape of life." He waited, not impatient, but as if he had given this explanation 100 times on the inside and was simply making it available. "When I was younger," he continued, "I thought preserving something was a way to own it. As I learned more, I realized it is a way to witness it." He looked at me then, and there was a steadiness that had been previously private. "I choose it because it sets my days. It tells me how to be. That is not to say I was not trained. Covenants and family practices have a power over us. But within that structure, I have aimed to make a practice that respects people." He said the last word with a softness I had not known he used. It was not an answer that ended my questioning. It was less of a revelation and more of a geography. He gave me the contours of his reasons rather than a center. I found myself wanting to ask, is that enough? Can a life built on small attentions withstand the economic and social temptations to exhibit? If you refuse spectacle, do you also refuse resources that could make your work easier? Elliot had refused the Foundation's display, but I could see the ledger needing new binding materials, the steward needing a pension, the younger archivist needing a salary. The moral choice had a cost, and choices cost more than we sometimes admit. He seemed to sense my worry. "There are costs," he said. "We have spoken of that." He looked at the ledger in a way that was not possessive, but careful, like someone considering the weather report before setting out a ladder. "Some names will be kept, because we can afford to keep them. Others will be outside our reach. That is the real problem this work reveals." He did not say whether he believed that choosing to keep someone would save them. He did not promise miracles. He simply said that the act of choosing was a practice he wanted to hold. That night, with the rain road mapping the windows, we made a small ritual. We pinned a list of names to the pantry door, nothing official, the way people pin shopping lists, just a small note: Mrs. H, Agnes W, Thomas L, the Martinez family. We folded the paper and let it hang under a magnet shaped like a heart. When I turned in for the night, the smear in the photograph had not resolved itself. It remained an open question, a weather pattern that changed the light through which our town viewed us. In my bed, I rehearsed the logistics of the choices we had begun to make. I thought of the steward's keys, the lawyer's clause, the bookshop owner's biscuits. I thought of the seamstress trunk that had been mentioned in town lore, an old trunk of mended garments and names stitched into hems, and how such an object could be the site of a small reclamation. I imagined, with a kind of cautious warmth, the possibility that preserving a name could be an act of repair for those who have been overlooked. On the kitchen table that morning there was a note from the steward. He had left it under a teacup, and in his hand the letters were blunt and tidy. "We have to think about a retirement for me. The ledger needs a successor." Under that, in smaller script, he added, "Bring the needle, I will teach you the first backstitch properly." The invitation was straightforward. It was also a summons into a practice that had begun to alter the shape of my life. Later that day, I walked to the bookshop. The bell chimed in a high, domestic way, and Mrs. Halliday slid me a biscuit with the right amount of sugar on top. She told me quietly that a woman had come in and asked whether we would ever publish the ledger, as if it were a novel. The woman had thought it a marvelous idea and wondered whether there were stories that could be extracted and bound anew. Mrs. Halliday smiled and said, "Some things do not want to be taken out of their margins." She closed the register and leaned toward me, biscuit dust making a faint constellation on her apron. "If you ask me," she said, "people like things that are tidy. Messy things take patience." The work of mending had begun to make my other habits look theatrical. I found myself once again on the edge of rooms wondering what it meant to be seen and what it meant to preserve. The ledger suggested that visibility and preservation were not the same. It invited a question I could not yet name. If keeping names is a practice, then how do we rehearse the next generation into it? If the steward retires, and the steward will, as all of us must, who will learn the stitch? The lawyer's clause would provide mechanisms, but mechanisms do not replace apprenticeship. There were practicalities to consider. Elliot wrote a short list that afternoon, pen precise. Materials needed, estimated costs, possible volunteers. He placed the list beside the ledger like a receipt. The next week, there would be a small committee meeting at the bookshop to discuss fundraising, tea and scones, a modest bake sale. It felt modest in the right way, an awning of ordinary patience thrown over a problem that could not be solved by spectacle. The smear remained as an image in the corner of my mind. It had, in some perverse way, clarified the kinds of work that mattered to Elliot and to the town. It had revealed the gap between town expectation and private practice. It had forced, for me, a painful but useful reorientation. I had thought I knew my husband because I had seen him perform in photographs and at dinners. Now I was learning to know him by the small reverences he practiced in the fold of an evening, by needle and tape and the slow gathering of names. There is, I learned from the steward, an ethics in margins. To care for a margin is to resist the demand that life be wholly legible. It is to say that some things must be tended in private so that the public can be trusted not to devour them. The steward said this not as doctrine but as memory. He tapped the ledger like clearing his throat and recounted the seamstress trunk story with wet eyes. "We had a trunk," he said. "Years ago, it was stuffed with garments people left at homes. The trunk kept their notes. When the trunk was opened, the town remembered things it had embarrassed itself by forgetting." He shrugged. "Small things can shift the town's heart." That afternoon, before I left to meet the archivist about cataloging procedures, Elliot handed me a small packet wrapped in plain paper. "Take care with those," he said. "They are not to be published." His voice folded the words into a boundary. I held the package like a living thing. Inside, under tissue, were several letters, small domestic petitions, requests for minor help, remembrances of names. Each had an instruction in his hand. Do not share. Return if requested. His handwriting was precise and careful, a map of obligations. I carried the packet in my bag and felt the weight of it like a secret. As I walked through the town square, people glanced, some with curiosity, some with the fondness reserved for people who stitch together community in their quiet ways. The smear of the photograph had become a subtext in many of those glances, a visible permission to ask questions. I had been given a new kind of visibility by the town's rumor. Not the bright stage light of the banquet hall, but the dimmer glow of the study lamp. That evening, with the parcel on the table, I sat down to write marginal notes on a page Elliot had left open. The needle lay ready. The steward had promised to begin lessons the following week. The lawyer had drafted the addendum. The bookshop owner had promised her back room for meetings. The young archivist had offered to create a digital index that would remain accessible only by permission. These were structures. They felt, to me, like scaffolding erected not to be admired, but to support tender labor. I had not yet asked him, in the form I now knew I wanted to ask, what it would mean for him to step away from the ledger if he chose to. I had not yet put into words the fear that the practice might be unsustainable, or that my own willingness to do small work was, in some measure, performative. What I had done was begin to take on the work with him, to learn the stitch, to set the kettle as he liked it. I had started to inhabit the margin. A letter I had found in the seamstress trunk said simply, "Keep names by the kettle, let them come when they like." That night, I folded the letter and placed it under the magnet on the pantry door beside the list we had pinned earlier. The paper seemed to collect the light. The name in the margin, the name the letter mentioned, pressed at me like a small, persistent question that demanded a life. I do not know yet, as I write this, whether our small practices will be sufficient. I only know that the town's appetite for spectacle has collided with a quieter ethic, and that in the collision new shapes are possible. The photograph remains a smear in the corner of our frames. The ledger remains a book on the shelf. Between them, there is a labor to be learned, and that labor must be tested in public procedure and private attentions both. The steward will teach me to stitch. The lawyer will file the addendum. The bookshop owner will bake for the fundraiser. The archivist will build a list. And Elliot will continue to refuse exhibitions and to accept the small sacrifices that keep the ledger alive. I find myself more and more standing in the study at dusk with a cup of tea and realizing that the work of choosing someone is less heroic than repetitive. It asks for the patience of holding a teacup until it cools, the economy of keeping a list, the humility to let a name be told slowly. Tomorrow I will take up the needle again. Tonight, as lamplight pools on the table and the parcel sits like a promise, I have decided to ask him in a different way. Not simply, did you choose, but when did you first feel the ledger make you? To know the moment a practice feels like one's own is to know the contour of obligation and of vocation. It is to know whether the ledger is an inherited duty that was taken on because it was the only available thing, or whether it became, a day by small day, a chosen work that defined how he engaged with the world. I fold the tea bag into the cup and watch the watercolor. The smear in the photograph will not vanish. But I have begun to learn that a life is less about being entirely seen than about learning how to keep someone when the world refuses to. If this intrigues you, share in the comments. What small thing would mark your choice? The letter I plan to fetch in the morning is tucked at the very back of the ledger. It is heavier than the others and has a margin note in Elliot's handwriting. For when she asks. I have not opened it. I will, with the steward's help, while the house is still quiet. I will bring the needle. I will test whether my hands can learn the stitch well enough to make a margin that holds. At the end of the day, the ledger sits open like a patient mouth, and in the lamplight I can almost hear the names turning, waiting to be called. I am learning how to call them, not loudly, not spectacularly, but in a way that honors the smallness of their claims. The work ahead is practical and costly, and I hope necessary. I'm not certain of the shape it will make, but I know enough to take up the needle and begin. I woke before dawn because the house has its own small anxieties at that hour. The pipes whispering, the cat padding like a soft apology down the stairs, the lamplight in the study a steady bruise against the dark. The packet Elliot had handed me the day before lay on the kitchen table like a thing with weight and heat. The steward's note about teaching me the backstitch was folded beneath it, the letters blunt and tidy in his hand. I poured water and watched the tea catch color. Steam braided upward and took the room with it. Outside, a sparrow made a sound like a coin dropped into a tin. I had decided, during a week of rehearsals in my head, that I would not let anyone else be present when I opened the letter stamped For when, she asks. Yet when the steward tapped on the door at 7:30, his keys making that small chime that had become an emblem of the house, I found that I wanted him there, not as an audience, but as a witness to the practice I was attempting. He brought his kit, a tin box of needles, a spool of linen thread, a folded cloth with ink smudges. He wore the fingerless gloves even though the morning was not cold. It looked to me then like a kind of armor. We sat at the long table in the study. Elliot fetched the lamplight and set it between us, the bulb soft as a moon. He did not sit very close. He kept a table's width as if to preserve the ledger's air. "Ready?" he asked, quietly, not demanding. I slid my thumb under the packet's flap. The paper tore with a faint, intimate sound, thin tissue complaining. Inside, folded like a map, was a single sheet written in his hand. He had written to me in the voice I had begun to love, direct, clause-like, earnest, without pretense. He had dated it 2 months earlier and placed a short note in the margin, small things, so that the steward would know when to hand it over. I read aloud because the steward's breathing made the room feel like an accordion, and because I wanted the sentences to leave the page and find air. He began, "My dear, if you are reading this, it means the house is still in one piece, and that I have trusted you with the small particular of a habit. There are many things I do not write down, because the list of them would be a vellum long, and would not fit in any reasonable margin. But I owe you an account, not of facts but of reasons, not of all, but of enough to explain why the ledger became an architecture under which I have tried to live. When I was a boy, my grandfather kept a box of things he called names. It was not full of names written out, but of tokens, a button with a mother's initials, a small coin, a torn scrap of a child's ribbon. He would take them out on winter evenings and say a thing like, 'These belong to our town, even if the town forgets them.' He never explained why it mattered. He only insisted on the retrieval of small things, a button, a name, a pot returned to a shelf. I thought, for a long time, that this was eccentricity. I began the ledger in a way that is embarrassingly practical, to keep track of who owed what, who had left what, who had been to whom with what favor. It read at first like any family account. Then names began to arrive at its margins. A note slipped under a shop counter, a scrap placed into a returned book, a voice saying, "Can you record that for me?" Someone asked for a name to be written beside the date of a soup delivered. Another asked that a nickname be preserved because their sons had squabbled and no one else would remember it. I did not set out to build an archive of lives. I made a system to keep small debts straight, and those small debts accreted into a history of attention. There was a moment, no single cinematographic instant but a season, when I recognized that to conserve the ledger was to conserve the people it mentioned. Conservation is not neutral. When you repair a spine, when you choose linen instead of paste, you are deciding which books may outlast the weather. The choice has a moral breadth. I learned to treat names like fragile vessels. Some bear the weight of public memorial, others contain intimate instructions. Mrs. H. Kettle, twice. You have asked, often in the way questions repeat like a clock, whether I became the ledger's keeper because a covenant obliged me or because I chose it. I want to give you an answer that is not defensive nor theatrical. I became it through accretion. I said yes to small things. I refused the grand things that would have made the ledger into a show. I was shaped by what my family expected, certainly, but the practice entered me and then redirected the shape of my days. It is a chosen life in the sense that I continue to choose it each time I close the book after a night of reading names. The smear in the photograph arrived later. I will not narrate its technicalities because it is not the point. The smear made the town hungry for explanation and hungry for spectacle. I withdrew, not because I wanted to be inaccessible, but because I wished the ledger to remain outside the curiosities my town wheeled like a cart. The ledger contains people who cannot be turned into artifacts. To declare them publicly would be to turn their small claims into things for display. That to me is worse than being invisible. I will not ask you to share this work. I will not demand your assent. I write this so that when you ask whether I chose it, you know that I did not stumble into it entirely unwillingly, nor did I accept it as a default. It has been both summons and service. It is also a labor with a price. A steward grows old, materials fray. Some names will be beyond our reach. I want you not to be surprised when the ledger asks for more than our hands can give. I want you to be ready to say no or yes with an understanding of what those words will cost. If you have come this far, if you read this with the steward at your other shoulder, I ask you for one thing. Practice the stitch with me. Not so that you will be conscripted into a vocation without choice, but so that the practice will be something we can offer each other when questions come again. If the ledger is to outlast me, it ought to be kept by people who understand why one chooses to keep a name. I love you in the way I know how to write. With facts, with small gestures, with the verb, tenses of tending. There are names I hope will be returned to people when they ask. There are names I hope we will keep because their keepers cannot. There are no easy answers. There is only the stitch. E. The steward tapped the table with an ink-stained finger. He did not say anything doctrinal, only he put it plain. The letter landed on me as both an accounting and an invitation. He had answered not by reciting a single origin, but by showing me the practice's accumulation. The question I had rehearsed now felt less like a test and more like an offer I could accept or decline. I felt able, for the first time, to let a choice remain porous. We set the needle together. The steward showed me the back stitch slowly, his hands like maps I followed with an apprentice's reverence. He looped the linen, pulled it through paper that resisted and then yielded, and explained why the stitch mattered. A backstitch carries tension well. It keeps a book from opening itself to ruin. He said it as if it were also a moral rule. The motion of the thread, the small repetition, settled something in me. It was not dramatic. It was, in truth, a relief. The week that followed was full of small logistical labors that had suddenly acquired a new meaning. We catalogued the letters in the parcel according to Elliot's notations. Do not share, return if requested, for private reading only. Each instruction read like a covenant reduced to a clause. We inventoried the materials Elliot had listed: linen thread, beeswax polish, a small humidifier for brittle pages, a machine that smelled faintly of ozone. I amused myself by imagining a ledger spa. The steward scolded me for jokes and offered a biscuit instead. There were committee meetings at the bookshop that reorganized themselves into something like a modest campaign: fundraising for a steward's pension, money for conservation supplies, a small honorarium for the young archivist who had been cataloging evenings unpaid. People brought scones and checkbooks. Mrs. Halliday sat behind the counter and kept the register open because she believed in paper as a truth-teller. My mother fussed with the seating as if she were arranging an assembly for a christening. My father, who liked things summed and circled, kept a ledger of his own for donations and potential expenses. We drafted a short brochure that told simply what conservation meant and why it might be worth a few pounds and a slice of cake. The steward, for reasons I only later understood, resisted any mention of a public spectacle. We are not making history into a show, he told the young archivist over tea. We are making sure that history keeps breathing. The archivist, eager and unpracticed with compromise, wanted interviews, a grant, a fellowship, practicalities that would professionalize the work and make his name appear in a bibliography. Elliot, when he attended these meetings, kept requests short and practical. Could the archivist be paid a modest stipend? Could the steward be offered a small pension fund? He refused, in the same patient way, any suggestion that the ledger be lifted as a trophy. It felt to him like the wrong kind of honoring. The Foundation wrote again, with a new angle, a touring exhibit and a catalogue with essays by scholars. They offered money that would have solved the steward's pension problem in a season. The young archivist, practical and tempted, entertained the possibility. The steward pressed a thumb into his pipe tin. Elliot, in the end, said no again, because he believed that the ledger's names should not be translated into objects for consumption. The Foundation responded with a polite corporate disappointment and a brochure for initiatives elsewhere. It is not that Elliot disliked money. He made rational plans for supplies on the list he had written, and he understood the steward's real needs. It is that he believed some honors, converted into spectacle, destroyed the dignity they meant to preserve. I have thought a great deal about that word dignity, how it sits between the pragmatic and the moral. The stitch we learn at the table is a way of practicing dignity in small acts, to put a note beside a name, to wait for a secret to be told rather than forcing it, to return a coat to an owner because you remember a button. We decided, not grandly but by conversation, by practical arithmetic, that we would take the Foundation's refusal and our community's bake sale and attempt to bridge the gap. The bookshop donated a month's worth of their window display. My mother organized a raffle. The town's gardener pledged a portion of his perennials for auction. The sum would not make a Foundation-sized grant, but when we tallied the donations and pledges, it would cover the steward's modest pension and supply a cushion for conservation materials for a year. Small economies are sometimes more durable than grand offerings. They ask of the people who give a repeated kindness. They do not fix the structural inequities that leave some names outside our reach, but they do make a practice possible. It is in that repetition that the ledger thrives. The seamstress trunk became the hinge of a public event because someone suggested it in a meeting and because the steward, with the fog of memory in his eyes, asked that it be opened properly. It had been, according to town law, lost for years under the church's eaves. Some thought it had been burned. The seamstress trunk, when it reappeared in the church basement, small, iron-bound, smelling of resin and old dust, was more domestic than legend had allowed. The custodian of the church brought it out like something alive. It was heavy. It bore a cloth cover mottled with time. When the steward set his fingers on the iron latch, my hands were cold and hot at once. We organized a reading in the church hall, not a spectacle, but a gathering. The steward, the bookshop owner, the young archivist, a few people who had been named in the ledger, and of course Elliot and me. We placed the trunk on a table and unfastened it carefully. Inside were garments wrapped in tissue, aprons, a child's sweater, a scarf with a trimmed edge, and folded into the pockets, small scraps of paper. The scraps were names and instructions. Nell, brown sugar in tea, she'll laugh if you call her any different. Tommy, keeps pennies under mattress, returns eggs sometimes. There was also a photograph, creased and soft with grease, of a man I did not recognize at first. The photograph, unlike the one that had smeared Elliot's eyes, was intact and ordinary. It showed a face in a hat and hands that stole at me like a backstory. We read names. The steward read slowly and with a voice that sometimes trembled. When a name was called, someone in the room, sometimes a stranger, would respond with a small claim. I mended her skirt, or I borrowed the pot. It happened with no grand gestures. Returned items were handed back where possible. Notes were folded and placed in envelopes. A small purse was found under the lining with a name stitched into it. One woman, near tears, retrieved a child's handkerchief with a monogram and laughed because of the absurdity of finding such a thing after so many years. The laughter had the shape of release. There was in that evening a quiet justice. Not the kind that rights grand wrongs, but the kind that restores small things. Sewn hems, a kettle's instruction, a nickname, so that a life's texture is not wholly lost. The town, invited to be present, watched as the steward pinned names onto a cloth and the bookshop owner wrote them in a ledger of her own. The young archivist photographed the pieces for preservation, but kept the files under a password that required consent. We were doing, in miniature, what Elliot had refused the Foundation to avoid, preserving a history. The smallness of our means made the act less spectacle and more lived covenant. After the trunk event, the young archivist came to me with a proposal that surprised me. He suggested a modest oral history project, not a grand archive for public consumption, but a closed series of tapes, recordings of names with permission to be used only if a person authorized them. He had been touched by the cassette Elliot played years ago and proposed a contemporary version. "Give them back their voices," he said, "on their terms." We agreed, and soon the study was equipped with a small recorder and a list of names to invite for a private reading. People came in pairs or not at all. Some sent letters. One afternoon, an elderly man came in with a shoebox of receipts and a quilted scrap, asking that his mother's name be recorded with the manner in which she cupped her hands around a tea saucer. He spoke in halting sentences and left lighter than when he came. Another woman, who had been listed in the ledger as Mrs. Zhao left winter yarn, asked that we ask about the attic beside her name, because she feared her attic contained more than yarn, perhaps an old letter, perhaps a name she was no longer prepared to part with. The tapes we made were slow and careful. They contained pauses, hummed tunes, the rustle of paper. The young archivist catalogued them, but required a signed release for any access. These were the kinds of measures that made the ledger feel alive to the people for whom the names mattered. They were not revolutionary. They were, however, practices that allowed the ledger to be an instrument of dignity rather than an exhibit of oddity. The legal addendum, too, moved from procedural draft into signed form in a small ceremony at the solicitor's office. The lawyer read the clauses aloud in her clipped, efficient voice. We added language that I myself had once only clumsily rehearsed. Custodianship voluntary, reviewable annually, right of names to be withdrawn upon request, penalties for unauthorized reproduction of letters. The clauses read like a fence. They did not make the house invulnerable, but they did make explicit a standard of consent. We left with signed pages folded into the lentil-brown folder the lawyer kept on her lap. The steward tucked the folder beside his pipe tin. It felt at the time like a sober, necessary thing. Elliot did not make a speech when the addendum was signed. He wrote later that the clause's real value was not juridical, but educational. It forced us, as a community, to name a practice and to teach it to new hands. My father, for all his accounting, said nothing dramatic at the table that night. He summed up the expenses and drew a column for the year ahead. My mother fussed in a domestic way that was both exasperating and tender. She wanted a ceremony to mark the addendum's signing. She wanted tea in her special pot. The ceremony she got was small and proper. Tea in the kitchen, clotted cream on scones, the steward's fingers making small rings in the saucer. Time, which has the unromantic habit of pressing on, made obligations real. The steward, who had been a fixture for 30 years, announced one evening in the spring that he wished to retire. He said it calmly. "My knees are knobbly," he joked, but the gravity of it landed on us like a small weather change. We had thought the problem of succession theoretical. Suddenly it demanded a plan. The steward wanted a modest retirement party, nothing more. We obliged and invited people who had names attached to the ledger. Those who could not come sent notes. At the party, the steward surprised everyone by telling a story I had not heard before, of the trunk and of a seamstress who had once stitched names into hems so that garments would bring a person's identity home. He spoke lightly, but his voice had a tremor that made the room attentive. "You teach someone the stitch," he said, "and the stitch teaches them back." He passed his keys to the young archivist with a ceremony small and precise. not a handing over of authority so much as an invitation to apprenticeship. The archivist, who had been trying to find a balance between method and conscience, promised to keep a schedule of lessons and to look after the steward in small ways. We arranged, by vote and modest pledges, a pension for the steward that would let him sleep without anxiety. He cried when we sang him an appropriated hymn, off-key and with laughter, and pressed a palm into my hand afterward, as if to say thank you in the language he had long kept. There were costs, of course. Materials wore out quicker than anticipated. The humidifier needed repairs. Some names were outside our reach, people whose relatives lived abroad, or who had slipped away before we could retrieve tokens. A schoolteacher named Rita wrote to tell the ledger that she had moved with the family and that some names she had collected would be hard to recover. She forwarded a list with an apologetic note. We put it in a folder labeled Attempts. Her due, the work sometimes felt like proof that small kindnesses cannot redeem structural absence. But it also proved, in those moments when a handkerchief was returned or a name was read and recognized, that attention mattered to people's daily arrangements. Elliot's refusal of the foundation had consequences we had not fully anticipated. The steward's pension would have been secured more easily with a single grant. Now we relied on the town's slow generosity. The young archivist, who had once dreamed of a research career, had to take a part-time post at the university library and assist the ledger work at odd hours. He came to the study after lectures and catalogued files by the light of Elliot's lamp. It was not glamorous. It was human. One afternoon, a woman came to the study carrying a trunk of her own. She had been a seamstress, she said, though everyone called her by her first name, Maggie, without the suffix of profession because everyone knew what she had done. She placed her trunk on the floor between us and opened it with care. Inside were mended sleeves, a child's shoe, a pile of tiny socks with names stitched inside. She had been in the seamstress trunk event and wanted to return something she had taken home years ago. A small shawl belonging to a Mrs. W. She had kept it, she said, because she thought the woman would like it, and because she had not found the chance to return it. We photographed the shawl, and then, to Maggie's delight and our own, found a niece of Mrs. W., who came with a photograph and a story about how the shawl had been her grandmother's favorite on market days. The shawl was returned in a quiet handoff, the niece's eyes wet, Maggie smiling in a private, tender way. It was nothing grand, but it made a seam of two lives close. There was an intimacy in the work that sometimes felt risky. To learn to keep a name is to be entrusted with secrets and confessions. Once, a man came in and asked that we note in the ledger that his sister's name be kept because she had been shamed by the town years earlier. He asked that we not make public the reason, only that we preserve her name and a small detail, the smell of lavender in the morning. We wrote the note and marked it private. The steward closed his eyes when he read the entry. It felt like being given custody of a vulnerable thing. In the study, late that autumn, when the light thinned early and the kettle sang twice, Elliot and I sat and made another small ritual. We had begun, as the letter had suggested, to pin names to the pantry door more systematically. The list had expanded beyond the first four. We pinned a small card beside each name with a line or two of instruction. Agnes W., kettle twice. Thomas L., likes sugar in tea. Martinez family, only send bread on Thursdays. These were not legal obligations. They were tender notes for anyone who might care for the household, and the names with equal attentiveness. I would wake sometimes and touch a card as if it were a talisman. The smear in the photograph remained a corner in our frames. It had not turned into spectacle. It had for many become an interpretive question. The person who had once seen it as proof of illness now called it a sign that the town could be cruel in its curiosity. For me, it became a kind of weather, something that made me look at the windows differently. I had practiced being seen. I had learned to love a life of visible competence. Elliot's life taught me a different kind of fidelity, one that asks for repetition and for small refusals of the stage. There were nights later when we would sit and the house would be quiet, except for the ledger's small noises, the turning of a page, the scritch of a pen. Elliot would read aloud, sometimes not from the ledger, but from the letters we had put into the safe. A woman's instructions for how she liked bread cut, a boy's note about which kite to fly in a storm. Once I read a longer letter that the steward had flagged and placed in folded tissue. It began, "Dear whoever keeps this, if someone is keeping my name, I will be honest. I'm ashamed I could not keep it better myself. I left for a while and came back in the wrong season. If you find my name, remember that my sister liked the blue dish and that her name was always said aloud before bed. If you can, make sure the blue dish is not broken. If you cannot, simply say her name into a cup and let the sound cool. I do not ask for much, only to be noticed. E.B." I cried when I read that, not because of high sentiment, but because the letter was modest and exact, and because it asked for so little. To be noticed, to have a name said into a cup, felt like the most human request. As winter moved in, the ledger's patterns became part of the town's rhythm, rather than an object of mere curiosity. People began to leave notes more often. A bag of knitting, a list of who had died, names once swallowed by the years. There were missteps. An unauthorized photocopy of a letter that circulated briefly, causing embarrassment and requiring apologies. We added a clause to the addendum addressing such things, clarifying that any reproduction required written consent. The young archivist redoubled his insistence on consent forms, and the steward muttered that people never read forms anyway. He smiled when we handled the problem and fixed the mess without spectacle. Elliot, in the quieter nights, showed me his method for cataloging marginalia. He taught me to identify handwriting by cadence, to read an initial and know roughly the year the notation had been made, to understand when an entry was a plea and when it was a simple fact. He explained, patient, modest, how to transcribe a letter without removing the voice from the original, the comma that meant a pause, the flourish that suggested a trembling hand. "You do not rescue a voice by making it politer," he told me once. "You rescue it by preserving its particularities." There were small triumphs. A woman named Elsie, the one who had written about keys and waiting, came to the study on a gray Tuesday, and with a hand that trembled, told us a story she had kept for 40 years about a neighbor who had mended boots in winter. She laughed at herself when she could not remember the man's name, and Elliot wrote it down as unnamed boot mender, ask at parish. We all smiled, because the ledger had done what it promised, to make a margin that allowed for forgetting and for retrieval. Spring came, late and hesitant. We moved the ledger to a small cabinet that had been refinished with beeswax polish. The steward had insisted on the wax. He said it would keep the wood breathing. It smelled like honey. We stood around it once, the four of us, Elliot, the steward, the young archivist, and me, and marked an anniversary for the ledger. No speeches, just a small toast with tea in chipped cups. The steward called it the year the ledger learned to ask for company. The young archivist added that it had become, for him, a source of careful joy. There remained always a residue of ambiguity. Some names continued to feel outside our reach. Some requests were too painful to grant. We could not fix economic insecurity or historical injustice with a stitch. But we could preserve the small ways people wanted to be noticed. The practice we had learned, pinning names, reading letters, refusing exhibition, made the ledger a modest instrument for community care. One afternoon, months after the steward's retirement and long after the trunk had been opened, I found myself in the study alone with Elliot. He had been quiet in the morning, a habit of his when he had been thinking. He set a small envelope on the table and, when I asked about it, said simply, "I thought you might like to see what I wrote next." It was not the grand explanation I had once wanted. It was a note, folded with a few lines in his precise handwriting. For the days when the town asks us to perform, refuse gracefully. For the days when we cannot refuse, keep the names safe. For the days when someone must leave, make sure their belt has a stitch. He had somehow anticipated the town's impatience and the small practicalities that keep a life together. I read the note and felt the ledger's logic as less a burden and more a composition, made of small decisions that made life possible. In the end, perhaps the transformation the title promises is that which happens not overnight, but over the slow accumulation of habits. I had thought I knew my husband because I had seen him in photographs and at dinners, because I had rehearsed my own role as his companion in the public register. I had not known the look on his hands when they folded into a letter, or the way his voice changed when he read the seamstress's note aloud. I had not known the way refusing exhibition could be a form of fidelity rather than obstinacy. I had, in the study's lamplight, begun to learn the practices that sustained him. The town still murmurs. The smear still circulates in conversation as an interpretive device. Some call it misfortune, others call it an image that forced a question. But what the smear could not do was to decide how we would keep one another. That decision, I have come to see, rests on a collection of small acts: a stitch, a cup of tea, an entry in a margin, a refusal of display. It is the daily repetitive work of making a margin that protects someone from being consumed by curiosity. There are no tidy endings to this work. The steward will grow older, the archivist will move through life, the town's appetites will change. The ledger will continue to require supplies. We will continue to convene the committee in the back of the bookshop and to bake scones and tally promises. There will be missteps, and sometimes people will misunderstand our motives. There will be nights when I, too, will want a public story to explain all the complexities of why one chooses a life. But I have learned to prefer a life that teaches me to stitch. On a Sunday at the end of the year, we held a small ritual that felt like a promise without pomp. The ledger sat on a simple pedestal in the bookshop's back room. People were invited to bring in a name they wished to be remembered and to leave an anecdote sealed in an envelope. The envelopes went into a wooden box with the steward's old keys tied around it. We read a handful aloud, short, precise, funny, dignified. A boy named Thomas was read, and his sister clapped. An older woman spoke about the kettle and how she had always liked it when two songs were hummed as water boiled. There were tears in the room, but also laughter. The event did not make headlines. It did not need to. That night, Elliot and I walked home beneath a sky that had learned to be clear. We held hands like people who had practiced a new skill and found it true. Hands know less of spectacle and more of persistence. We returned to the study where the ledger sat like a small city of paper. I pinned a new card on the pantry door, an invitation this time. If you wish a name kept, leave a note under the teapot. We both laughed softly because it felt both modest and oddly revolutionary. The photograph, its smear, remains a kind of weather in our house. Sometimes it is a cloud, sometimes it is a shade that makes lamplight gentler. I no longer approach it as if it were a riddle to be solved, but rather as a reminder that people are not always legible in a single frame. The ledger, by contrast, is an accumulation of attention. It is not tidy, and it is not an answer. It is a discipline. If you have read this far, you have come into the study with me in spirit. Perhaps you have wondered what small thing would mark your choice. Would it be making tea a particular way? Keeping a list of names you will call each year? Visiting an old neighbor on Thursdays? For me, the answer is the stitch, the repeated small attention that makes a margin, and by doing so gives names a place to live. If this story touches you, leave a note below. What small thing would you do to keep a name? Would you bake, write, stitch, or simply listen? If you would like more stories about quiet care and the ordinary work that builds moral life, subscribe and come back for another hour in the study. Tonight, as the lamplight pools and the kettle has finished its second song, I will take up the needle again, The ledger will be open. Names will wait. We will learn day by day how to keep one another.